Good morning. My name is Nasia Safdar. I'm the Associate Dean for Clinical Trials at UW-SMPH and a professor in infectious diseases at UW Health. This is an opportunity today for Clinical Trials Day to, I think, do two things. One is to acknowledge the tremendous effort and the complexity of clinical trials and the way that teams come together, not just in COVID, but also ever since clinical trials became a thing, to enroll participants, collect the data, and deliver on results. I think the other thing is to acknowledge is that clinical trials are really the only mechanism that we have and the best way to be able to change standard of care and to make movements and advances in clinical practice when the occasion demands it. And so the work that the professionals in clinical trials do cannot be overstated in terms of its importance and its relevance to human health. I think if there was one thing that COVID showed us, it is that without this infrastructure and without these teams in place, there is no way that we could have done as much as you all did during that time to enroll participants and generate data. I think the other thing that's really important to acknowledge today is that without participants, there would be no clinical trials. You can have the best designed trial in the world with all the infrastructure surrounding it that you could wish for, but if no one joins, that trial is not going to go anywhere. And so a big thank you to all the participants in our clinical trials over the years and for those that are thinking about volunteering for the future. It, of course, is a testament also to the complex and really important work that the research coordinators do, because it is an art and a science to enroll in clinical trials, and that group of individuals with their training and their experience does that job exceedingly well. Today, we'll hear from a number of highly accomplished people who've been engaged in clinical trials for a long time to share their wisdom with us and their findings. And we're very grateful to all the collaboration that goes on in our environment to enable us to do this work. Thank you so much for joining and enjoy the rest of your day. I will turn it back over to Betsy.
Thank you so much, Nazia. And we're going to go ahead and get started here with just an update on clinical trials and looking forward to what's coming up in the next fiscal year. So just a little bit of a reminder, and probably many of you are sick of seeing this slide, but I always do like to remind folks, and those that may be new haven't seen it. When we talk about clinical trials at UW, we're really talking about the three different areas that come together to make this work. So UW-Madison with compliance, the IRB, RSP, UW Health that holds our systems, our providers, and our patients, and of course SMPH, where many of our clinical departments reside, as well as our clinical research professionals and our PIs. So all of this comes together to make the UW Clinical Trials Enterprise. Just a reminder of our clinical trial strategic plan, which is in operation since 2020 and going till 2026. We really have a four-pillared approach. The first pillar being developing structures to really support industry research sponsors, but also our own investigators with easier access to clinical trial services. We're working in the second pillar on building systems and processes that support enterprise-wide clinical research right now, but also prepare us for our growth in the future. The third pillar is around creating a quality program that supports the highest quality research in our institution and also prepares us for accreditation. And the fourth pillar is around driving culture change by really engaging with all of you, our staff, our providers, and our patients to increase our participation and enhance our clinical research. As you probably know, the Clinical Research Office is a collaborative decision-making organization, and we have many groups working together, including the Clinical Trials Leadership Team, our Clinical Trials Advisory Boards, and also our Clinical Trials Tactical Work Groups that help us attack various issues that we need to work on and we need to improve workflows. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about our priorities for 2023. I'm really excited about all the progress that we've already made, but we still have some work to do. And so I want to focus on some of those areas that we're going to be looking at in the next fiscal year. So really our current status is that we're changing. And I think in the past 2 years, we've seen a lot of maturity in our organization as a research organization. We've moved from just getting things together the best we could, cobbling things together to do research, to thinking about it more strategically and systematically. And that maturity is wonderful for our organization. But at the same time, it requires us to continue thinking and working on quality improvement in our processes. Our collaboration has increased. We see studies being done across the organization using multiple departments and teams within one organization, within multiple sets of our organizations. And that's really wonderful to see because it means we can do bigger and more complex studies. We've become really adaptable during COVID, which was sort of a requirement. It may not have been a choice, but we figured out how to do things like remote consenting, how to work with our patients to make sure that we can get them into visits or have them do visits other places within their home, send phlebotomists other places and study teams. So we've really done a great job of being adaptable and creating systems that allowed us to do that. We're looking at our sites for research. As we're growing, we're finding that we need more space for research, and we maybe need even more sites for research. So looking at over the next fiscal year, where can we find additional sites to perform research and also use the right sites for the right research? So really pairing the research with the appropriate site in which to do it. Our number of clinical trials are increasing, and we're being very thoughtful about what those clinical trials are that we're bringing into our organization. Are they important for patient care? Are they really a focus for growth for our investigators? Why are we looking at these trials and what's the importance of them? We're doing some of that thought process early on so we get the right trials for our sites. We're looking at the quality of our processes. We've already done process improvement on some of the startup processes and are continuing to do that throughout the next year. We're increasing our efficiency. Many of you probably know that during COVID, many of our trials were getting opened within 21 days. Not that that would be our standard, but it certainly shows that we can be very efficient when we work at it. And so continuing to work on that and trying to really get our trials open and up and running within a 60 to 90 day window. And our reputation around clinical trials is really improving. We're being sought after by some of the large pharmaceutical companies to continue to do clinical trials with them, and getting a lot of inquiries about working with UW as a site. So all of those things and all of those changes are because of all of you and the incredible work that you've done over the past 2 years to make UW clinical trials a really important part of the clinical trials landscape in Wisconsin. A couple of the areas that we're going to be focusing on in 2023 are really our UW Health, so our clinical supporting infrastructure. So things like HealthLink and the Pharmaceutical Research Center and lab and analytics to really support our ability to do clinical trials. And how do we grow that infrastructure and make sure that it's supportive? We're also doing a lot of work with nursing and other clinical areas to make sure that we can work alongside our clinical partners for the best outcomes for our patients and our clinical trials. We're recruiting really talented research professionals, and we're working on career ladders for those professionals so that they can see where their next step is within our organization, and we can get some of the best folks in Wisconsin working at UW. We're working on engagement and training of UW Health staff that are working in our integrated research settings, particularly in the inpatient setting right now, but hopefully soon in ambulatory settings as well. We're enhancing our communication, and as you probably saw on my first slide, we have a new website for clinical research professionals, also industry sponsors, as well as patients. It's uwclinicaltrials.org. We're using technology to improve our recruitment and reduce the burden of trials. One of those has been the Encore integration project, which will continue into 2023. So allowing us to use our technology effectively and also minimizing rework by allowing us just to enter data once into one system. As I mentioned, we're looking at the addition of new research sites, and we'll have more on that hopefully later in the summer. And we're also looking at shared research space and using research activities in the right space. So all of that will be coming later this summer. In terms of successful clinical trials, we already talked about using technology. We're working to formulate collaboration across research teams for some large studies. As you probably all know, we were very involved in the vaccine studies, which required this collaboration. And we're going to continue in that spirit with working with some larger organizations on studies that really require us to work across the entire health system to do adequate recruitment and really make those trials successful. We're working on continuous quality improvement on our research workflows and providing training to our clinical research professionals on quality improvement. We're being strategic about our selection of trials. Are these trials right for our patients, our institutions, and our researchers? We're at a position where we don't need to take all comers. We really want to focus on those trials that are important to us here at UW. Do we have the right population for the trials? Can we recruit for them successfully? And can we collaborate with others in the institution to enhance our possibility of success? We also are working on a UW Health Research Committee that will hopefully be up and running in August 2022 to really help with the feasibility and engagement process across UW Health for all studies that will be taking place in our clinical areas. Our last area of real focus is quality and compliance. We're going to begin our preparations for SASE accreditation through ACRES. And so you'll be hearing a lot more about that across the summer and fall. We're redesigning complex workflows to make them more streamlined and efficient for our clinical research teams. We're ensuring the additional work that we're doing is value added. We don't want to do things just to do busy work and have more paperwork. We want to make sure that everything that we're adding to our workflows really increases the quality of our research. We want to empower our researchers and teams by enhancing their training and compliance support to allow them to create workflows within their own studies that are the highest quality that they can develop. We're embedding quality improvement into our overall workflows and looking at consistent SOPs across UW Health and UW for clinical research. We want to support our researchers through monitoring, audits, and inspections where we can work together to find a resolution to issues. And we want to make sure that quality is our goal. When we think about compliance and quality, compliance is sort of the bottom, it's the requirement, but quality is our aspirational goal. We want to do the highest quality studies that we can. And my favorite saying, and what we're really trying to do here, is we want to make the right thing to do at UW the easy thing to do. So we're trying to align our workflows and our systems to make it easier to do what we need to do for our patients and for our clinical trials. So that's what I have for you today. Are there any questions right now? I don't see any specific questions. So we're going to move on to a really exciting portion of our presentation today, which is Dr. Kwon and Ms. Amy Medina talking about a clinical trial that they've both been involved in. So Jennifer and Amy, I will turn it over to you now.
I've been involved with child neurology for nearly 30 years. That's a little horrifying. And spinal muscular atrophy has been a regular presence in my practice. It can take many forms, but whatever form it takes, it remains a disorder of profound weakness in children that worsens over time. It is due to the fact that the motor neuron that starts at the spinal cord and goes to the muscle is not receiving a vital protein called SMN protein, which is required for its ongoing survival. The brains of children with spinal muscular atrophy develop normally, and many of them are thought to be quite bright, actually. The incidence is relatively common for a rare disorder, so it's 1 in 10,000. And that means that in the practice of a general child neurologist in an academic center, as I have been for most of my career, we will probably see at least one child a year present with spinal muscular atrophy. And it occurs in all populations. The cause of this disorder is a lack of SMN protein, and the primary driver of SMN protein is the SMN1 gene. This gene is entirely non-functional in children with spinal muscular atrophy. And this is the gene that we'll focus on, the SMN1 gene. The most common and severe form of spinal muscular atrophy that we saw in clinical practice and that we continue to see in clinical practice is the one we called SMA type 1. These infants present early in life. They may be bright and engaging, but it is clear that their arms and legs are weak. They cannot be lifted against gravity. And this weakness progresses over time. Without medical intervention and support, these children will die before the age of 2 years. This little boy, his limbs are propped in the position that you see him in. He cannot position himself like this. You see the splints that he has to wear because he cannot keep his joints mobile. And without the splints, contractures will develop, which can cause more pain and disability. You see that he requires chronic ventilation. Children with spinal muscular atrophy have a great deal of, type 1, have a great deal of difficulty breathing. And what you don't see is that he also requires G-tube feeding. This graph is meant to show the natural history of spinal muscular atrophy type 1 that I was all too familiar with, which shows that the bottom line is in months. These are months of life. And you can see that children with the most severe form of spinal muscular atrophy decline. They experience death or the need for permanent ventilation by the time they are 20 months of life. So in the early 2010s, researchers developed a novel way of replacing the SMN1 gene in animal models, which was then tested in humans. The University of Wisconsin was one of the early participants in a clinical trial called SPRINT, in which this gene therapy was provided to infants who were genetically at risk for this severe form of spinal muscular atrophy. Now, how did families know that their infants would be at risk? Because it is actually hard clinically to tell at less than 6 weeks of age if your child has spinal muscular atrophy. Well, these were generally, the families were recruited generally had a history of spinal muscular atrophy type 1 that was diagnosed with symptoms and where children experienced the decline. So these were families who were motivated that their next child be tested early and be treated early. So what we see is, first, the red line is that natural history of spinal muscular atrophy. And the 26% shows that by 14 months of age, 26% of children with spinal muscular atrophy type 1 either die or require permanent ventilation. However, 100% of the infants who were treated early with gene therapy, I apologize, I'll go back, early with gene therapy survived. And in fact, what we know from this trial is not only did they survive, they gained motor milestones. They were able to sit and stand and walk at 14 months of age. So for me, as a child neurologist who helps support families with these extremely weak children, I would say that this research has had a profound effect on my life and my practice. And I am so proud to be part of the team here, the clinical trials team, that was able to make these results available. This is a map of the United States that shows newborn screening for spinal muscular atrophy. It is treatments like the ones that were studied at the University of Wisconsin that have driven states across the country to screen for this disorder, to allow infants, like the infants who participated in these trials, the opportunity for early treatment. And just to put this all in context, the SPRINT trial started in 2018. And it was around that time that the Federal Advisory Committee thought that newborn screening for spinal muscular atrophy would be worthwhile because there were actually other treatments already available. But I think it was really with the data from trials like SPRINT that gene therapy became approved just in 2019. And because of that, we have different therapies that we can offer to newborns who are diagnosed with spinal muscular atrophy. So I'd just like to end this talk by thanking again the participants in clinical trials, including the participants from our site, whose families have been so dedicated. It's not easy to be a clinical trial participant, but they have been wonderful about helping these companies collect the data needed to move these treatments forward. And I do thank the Clinical Trial Research Office here, which has just been wonderful to work with, highly professional. And as they say, there are companies who are eager to work with them because of that. Thank you. Oh, hi, Amelia. So Amy Medina is introducing the clinical trial participant, Amelia. Amelia, can we all see you and your pretty hair?
Are you Princess?
Amelia's not here.
Who's here?
Oh, hi. Can you say hi?
Hi. Okay.
Amelia's
That's
not
okay.
here. Amelia.
So Amy so tell us about your experience participating in the SPRINT trial.
Sure. So hi everyone, I'm Amy Medina. I am a mother to actually 3 SMA children. And as Dr. Kwon had stated, we knew that because my husband and I were carriers that we had a 1 in 4 chance with every pregnancy to have an affected baby. So when I was pregnant with my 3rd child, Amelia, who was just there, she ran to the bathroom real quickly. I had an amniocentesis and learned early on that she was also going to be affected like her older brothers. At that time, my kids go to American Family Children's Hospital. We learned that there was going to be a new clinical drug trial enrolling. And of course, we were eager to participate in that as long as Amelia met all the qualifications to get into that trial. My experience with the staff at the hospital is just amazing. They were always there to support our family, whether we chose to go with the trial or make a different decision to go with a different drug. They said they were supporting us. They were there. They called us. Just knowing that somebody is on our side is really amazing during a very, very difficult time. To give your child to research is very difficult. You have to sign a lot of waivers. You don't know what the outcome is going to be. You're basically hoping for the best because my oldest son is 10 and he is very similar to the pictures that Dr. Kwon showed. He is trached, G-tube, no movement. So we knew that whatever we were doing with research, the outcome would be better than how Mateo is. So we were willing to risk that. And Amelia received Zolgensma at 11 days of life. And it was like this big, amazing miracle that happened. Her room was filled with everybody that we had worked with, and everyone was just so excited to see this happen with her. And she turned 4 at the end of March, and she is meeting every milestone.
Bye.
Oh, here she is. So she is our princess of the family. She walks, she talks, she runs. She is very intelligent, sassy.
And I, well, not
Oh, not sassy. What?
and I can do gymnastics.
She can do gymnastics.
Yeah, because I'm good at gymnastics.
So being able to participate in a clinical drug trial has just really made her life amazing. And we couldn't be more thankful to the clinical research team in the hospital for continuing to support us, because she still does come to the hospital for follow-up stuff. And she was just there on Monday going through testing. And one thing as a parent, I think it's important to know that I know that she is the patient, but it's so amazing when the hospital supports the parents too, because we go through a lot of things emotionally as well. And we need to be supported as well. And we are given that through the hospital and Dr. Kwon and her staff. So just a huge thank you for everybody that is on our team.
I like it.
Amelia, you did an awesome job. First of all, thank you so much for being able to talk to everybody. We really appreciate you. And thank you, Amy and Dr. Kwon. I think there are a few questions that we have. One for you, Amy.
Yes.
Can you talk about when you were first considering this clinical trial, what some of your biggest concerns were?
I think just knowing what the outcome was going to be, if it was going to be worth it. What I didn't mention is that my middle child was part of a different clinical drug trial at a different location. So we knew what that drug did, and it was we had to weigh, like, do we go with what we know that's working, or do we dive into another research and hope for the best? And she was the first one to receive it pre-symptomatically, so there was no research for us to, or families to look at for support. So we know the outcome of SMA is death, and so we I guess, as my husband and I, just decided to, hope that this was going to do wonderful things for her, which it has, obviously.
Thank you, Amy. Dr. Kwon, a question for you. How many patients were enrolled at UW on the trial?
For this particular trial, we had 2. And the other child is doing equally well. She, in fact, the family tells me that they are always getting questioned about whether they are sure that she really had SMA. So,
wow.
Of course, as part of the clinical trial, we do, there's very careful genetic testing that is done. But I think it really just shows how well children can do, especially if they're treated early. I use the Medina's experience to guide how we treat children who are identified by newborn screening. I think that you have to imagine what it must be like to be somebody who just had a baby, but who is going to enroll them in a clinical trial as quickly as possible. It was truly heroic what Amy did with her second child and with Amelia during a time when she really should have been recovering and resting herself. So we try to keep in mind how challenging it is to identify newborns and to explain to their families the difficulty of this disease. But we look at her children and we want these other babies to have the same chance. So we do everything we can to start treatment early. I know Amelia always hates it when I go on and on, so I'm going to stop now.
Dr. Kwon, just to follow up, Kelly Miller was curious, how many were enrolled overall in the trial?
So the data that I showed includes 14 children, but there were more children involved in SPRINT because they stratified them by another gene that they have. There's a copy gene called SMN2, and that makes a very small amount of SMN protein, just really enough for initial survival. And so children with 2 copies of SMN2, such as Amelia, were segregated from children with 3 copies of SMN2, and it was approximately the same number of children in the 3-copy group.
Great, thank you. Amy, for you, did the ability to participate in innovations in medicine through clinical trials change the way you think about UW as a care provider?
I've always had positive things, so it just went above and beyond than what I've already thought. Like, it's just amazing that all these doctors are wanting to learn science and do amazing things with diseases and disorders that families are affected with.
Great, thank you.
And
And Amy, another question for you. What do you feel we can do to make sure patients who need clinical trials are aware of what's available?
So I think I was at an advantage because I already knew about trials and did all my research. But if Amelia was my first child, that would look very different, and I wouldn't know what to do, and I wouldn't know, like, just learning about what disease my child was just diagnosed with, and then knowing what needs to happen from there. I just think having it published somewhere, having the doctors know about trials and being able to give that information to families, and letting the family make that decision, maybe sharing any stories that there were trials already, like, this is Amelia and this is what can happen. Because when you get a diagnosis, that's really hard just in general to receive that and grieve that and know what the next steps are needed. And I know some people don't understand the importance of SMA really starts affecting them immediately, and you really need to jump on this quickly. But if I was a new mom not knowing SMA, I wouldn't know all that. So I think it's just education and the doctors being able to be up to speed on what trials are out there for the disease.
Great, thank you. Dr. Kwon, it seems like your clinical trials are very mission driven and you're very engaged, obviously. How important do you think both of those things have been in your success in clinical trials to date?
So the clinical trials like this one for gene therapy, I would say I play a fairly small role. The kind of gene therapy trials that are done across the US require a great deal of regulatory oversight to make sure that the treatments are safe for patients. I would say that the amount of paperwork, the amount of documentation, the care with which you have to document really everything is something that is beyond my capacity as a site investigator. I rely so very heavily on the team that I have at the clinical research office to help me with these trials. So this, I can't thank this team enough. They have been extraordinary. So I would say UW has had a lot of foresight in developing this centralized program of a centralized group of people to conduct clinical research across all disciplines. And I really appreciate that. And I think we've really benefited from that.
Great, thank you. Dr. Kwon, another question. It might not apply as much to this trial, but maybe other trials you're considering. How do you think some of the change in focus that's been happening around including diverse populations in research might change the way you either recruit or think about your research?
I think that my hope is that what it will do is, so when we talk about diverse populations, we often talk about populations that where people may, I would say that one of the things that Amelia's mother, Amy, pointed out is how hard it is to sort of gather all this information. And you have to imagine that somebody like Amy just has incredible resources of just her own desire to make sure that her children are safe and healthy, driving her. I think that the emphasis on diversity will help support families like the Medinas in participating in trials, and hopefully will offer them more.
Great, thank you. So this is really for Dr. Kwon and Amy. How long are the participants followed? Is this a lifetime? Is this, 10 years? How long do you follow patients in this particular trial?
Well, the oldest child treated with gene therapy for SMA is about 8 years old. So there are many questions that we still need to answer about gene therapy. We think it's very effective, but we would like to follow these children as long as we can. For personal reasons, I would like to follow Amelia as long as I can. But so what companies do who sponsor these programs is they design trials, they design the initial clinical trial to look at effect. Then they often design subsequent trials to look at long-term outcomes in order to be able to share that information. So while, participants can leave trials at any time, we're very appreciative to those who are willing to hang in there with us to help others understand how these treatments are working.
Great, thank you so much. So there is another question here about actually our clinical trials initiatives around patient experience for 2023. And so just to talk about that a little bit, I think part of our maturation as an organization is really thinking about a patient-centric research experience. And so I think you're seeing one of those here, where it was very focused on Amelia and her family, but would love to see that throughout our organization. Oftentimes, patients that go on clinical trials can be very ill. And so asking them to put in a lot of extra effort and visits to participate in a clinical trial can be burdensome. And so when we get protocols, really thinking about how we may be able to work with patients who are already coming in for other visits, who maybe are already going to the lab to have blood drawn. Maybe we're sending phlebotomists to their home if that's possible. So really thinking about the patient experience in clinical trials, because one of the things we have heard from patients is the reason that they don't want to participate in a trial is it's too hard for them. They have to work, or they have to rely on a family member to drive them who works, and it can be very difficult. And we have previously been a 9-to-5 clinical research organization. And so we're thinking about broadening our ability to enroll patients on weekends or maybe evening hours after work, things like that, that allow us to get a broader segment of the community involved in clinical trials. The other thing, and I'll rely on what Lynn Schnapp has always said, the chair of Department of Medicine, we really want to offer the ability to participate in a clinical trial if patients are interested, to every patient that comes to UW. So that's really one of our aspirational goals, both to make that opportunity available, which really we did during COVID, whether we wanted to or not. We had all these trials open for COVID vaccines. And so a lot of folks that wouldn't have otherwise participated in clinical trials had an opportunity. And additionally, we're adding a lot of clinical trials each day, and we'll be using technology to help us and patients know which clinical trials they might be eligible for, even if they're healthy. There may be clinical trials that they're interested in around diagnostics and screening. And so we want to make sure that we're providing those opportunities when they're relevant to patients. I think another part of this story is using our technology to get clinical trials in front of patients at the right point in time. As Dr. Kwon said, right when these babies are born and get tested is when you really have to start talking about enrolling in a clinical trial. And so many of our clinical trials operate that way, where we really need to talk to patients before or when treatment decisions are being made, because a clinical trial might be one of those treatments. And so that's a little bit hard for investigators to keep all of the clinical trials in their mind. And so we're looking at ways that we can use technology to get clinical trials in front of our providers and our patients at the time that they're making those decisions. So there's another question, and I guess this would be really open to everyone. How important is it for people like Amy to tell their stories about participating in clinical trials? And I know Dr. Kwon and Amy, you both have done a lot of speaking about this particular clinical trial, but how important do you think that is?
Well, I will introduce Amy and say that I think it's been incredibly important. And Amy has actually touched a lot of families with SMA over the years with stories about her children. And I think it might be hard for her to sort of like blow her own horn, so to speak. But when I feel like I recognize photographs of her before I even met her because of her experience with her second son. So I know that it's been really incredibly important for me and other clinicians like me in terms of understanding how well these treatments and clinical trial participation, how well they can go.
I'd have to agree with her. I know that I have shared my story with a lot of SMA families that I'm connected with on Facebook. I might not know the people in person, but we are a very strong community. And so through my stories, I've been able to connect other families to clinical drug trials. One of my best friends from Colorado, she was pregnant right after I had Amelia, and I was like, here's the information. This is, what's out there. This was her second SMA child. She had her first pass away several years ago. So she was very disconnected with what was happening in the SMA world. And so through me sharing my experience, her son is now thriving just like Amelia.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Amy. Another question. It sounds like this particular clinical trial, and maybe others like it, had an influence on screening for SMA. Can you talk a little bit about the intersection between health policy and what may be going on in clinical trials as innovation?
So what I would say was interesting about SMA, when it was introduced for national newborn screening, there was one treatment that was available. And the treatment was one that I would say people were somewhat uncomfortable with because it involved a more invasive procedure to provide drug. And it also involved repeated dosing of the drug over the lifetime of the individual. And that treatment just feels somewhat onerous. So it was uncomfortable for the committee advising newborn screening practice, at least, to sort of say, they were sort of thinking through, like, is this a policy we want to make? We want to say that every state should follow. And it was the knowledge that this gene therapy trial, which is a one-time dose of medication intravenously, so not through a lumbar puncture, which was felt to be more invasive. It was the knowledge of those trials taking place that really, I think, sort of tipped the committee towards approving SMA newborn screening. But what was interesting was even then, because the trials were taking place and we're used to FDA approval coming several years after clinical trials, people were still not thinking that we were going to have gene therapy anytime soon. And I would say that it was quite a shock to see that gene therapy was available a year after they recommended newborn screening for SMA. And I think it was a lucky coincidence. And it's really one of the reasons why so many states have picked up SMA so quickly. It may seem like, well, why doesn't every state screen for it? But the fact is that for a state to add a new disorder to their newborn screening rolls, it usually takes years. And so the fact that states have been able to do this within 2 to 3 years is quite remarkable, and I think speaks to the effectiveness of the treatments for SMA.
So Dr. Kwon, it sounds like this was obviously fast-tracked through the FDA at some point when it was deemed to be effective. How many patients do you recall had been treated before the FDA saw the impressive effects and was able to move this forward?
The FDA moved this drug forward based on relatively little data from clinical trials. I think that what you have to remember is that for me and for clinicians like me, to be able to see a child like Amelia, who has a diagnosis of really the most dreaded form of SMA, it is an effect that is close to miraculous. We don't usually get to see this with a lot of our clinical trial work. But when you see an effect like that, everyone, including the FDA, is willing to put it maybe on an even faster track, because the consequences of not treating are also hard. There's so much that we don't know still about gene therapy, except that so far it seems like it's delivering on its promise. But, and the FDA wants to be cautious, but the consequences of not treating Amelia are so severe, and to be able to see a child like this with SMA is just so unbelievable, really. I think that was part of what drove that forward. It is a special case. I will admit it is a special case, but it's also because I think a lot of pieces of clinical trial work and documentation of effectiveness were already in place, that it was able to take advantage of that infrastructure to be approved.
Thank you, Dr. Kwon. So it doesn't look like we have any other questions, but I want to thank Dr. Kwon and Amy and Amelia for coming and sharing their stories with us today. It truly is an incredible opportunity to see Amelia and how healthy and happy she is, and cute also. My daughter's named Amelia, so of course I love that name, but she's just darling. And what a wonderful example of how clinical trials can change someone's life. So thank you so much for sharing your story. We really all appreciate that. To our research community out there, I do want to remind you that we have some upcoming research forums, probably not the tearjerker that this one was, but around some important topics like clinicaltrials.gov and making sure that we have the registration process appropriately performed so that we can make sure people can find our clinical trials here at UW. Also looking at compliance versus quality and how we really strive to have high quality clinical trials, and also about the FDA oversight process and how we get new drug applications or new device exemptions completed at our organization. So look forward to those. They'll be posted on our website. I will also put a shout out that we have the SOCRA GCP training and test prep coming up on October 3rd. On October 4th, we're going to have the certification test. And October 5th is going to be the first ever Wisconsin Collaborative Clinical Research Professionals Conference. So look for more information coming up on that. That's a conference that really goes across the state and will be providing information of interest to clinical trials professionals. So thank you all for joining us today. Thank you to our speakers and to Nazia. And we'll give you a few moments back in your day. Thank you so much. Bye, Amelia.
Bye, bye, bye.